Okay, we're on page 79. Now, last week we left off explaining about on page 78, around verse 72, about we started seeing how about explaining how Yahweh resists the proud, because when somebody's proud, they don't accept authority. And if they don't accept authority, then, of course, they don't accept some authority instructing them. And so, therefore, if there's no instruction, then chaos will eventually be the result. And, of course, with chaos, there's no order. And if there's no order, then, of course, there's destruction. And so we can see that this lesson has to be learned by mankind in order to realize why he was made. Because, Yahweh made man. Man didn't just come about. Yahweh created mankind. He didn't just evolve, he was created, and then, of course, woman was made from man. But the scheme of Satan and, of course, of the gods is, and it's always been the same, to try and make man think proudly that he doesn't need his creator and that he can achieve a higher status, than Yahweh, making himself equal to Yahweh. And that's exactly what Satan did. And this is when, of course, sin entered into mankind and the establishment of God worship began to flourish. And Yahweh became just another god in the eyes of mankind. And so Satan made mankind to think that they could actually be equal with Yahweh, okay, and that they could achieve the result of becoming a god, which is foolishness, okay. So looking back here on page 78, let's look at verse 72. You remember he was talking about the disciples, and they said, who is the greatest in the kingdom? He says that was the question, who will receive the greatest amount of power? And when you exalt yourself by rebellion, you're saying, I have no need of making that connection. This is where we're at, by the way, right here in about this second paragraph above the little box. And so he says, when you exalt yourself by rebellion, you're saying, I have no need of making this connection with Yahweh. So what you're actually saying is, I desire this connection right now with Satan more than I desire the connection with Yahweh. All the things that you've been working for to achieve, to be with Yahweh. And remember, highlight the next sentence there, or next two sentences. We're always going to be dependent on Yahweh. This is promised throughout the Holy Scriptures. I will show you why we're always going to be dependent on Yahweh. Okay? Highlight that section. Now, we're always going to be dependent upon Yahweh because you can't live without Yahweh. Yahweh is our life. He's the source of all life. He's the source of all power. Now here, this is in Acts 17:28. It says, for in him, in Yahweh, we live, we move, and have our being, okay? Now the word in, I-N, is 17:22, and it actually means through or by the means of, okay? By the means of Yahweh, our Heavenly Father, and our Creator, okay? So it's through Him. It's by His means that we live, move, and have our being. The words we live, we have life in our bodies, because without it being His will, we'd be without life. And He'll always be the only source of life. We'll be made into His likeness, and we're given the power to create life. However, that power will always originate from Yahweh Himself. So we can never claim it as our own, otherwise we'd be like Satan. But Satan had it, remember. She had the power to create, to give life, to maintain flesh, but it was taken away from her, right? And Yahshua was given to it. But remember, it's promised as it's promised to the sons of man, okay? And if you remember what Yeshua said in Yachanan 5, verse 26, he says, for just as the Father has life in Himself, so He has given it to the Son to have life in Himself. Okay? So that power of authority is there to have life and to be able to give life and to maintain it. The word move, remember it says, in Him we live, we move, and have our being. The word move in Thayer's is number 2795, and it means to be moved or move. Speaking of that motion, which is evidence of life, okay? It's speaking about life itself, the evidence of life. And, of course, the word have our being is number 2070, and it simply means just that, to be or to have being, okay? which means we exist, okay? So it's through him that we live, we move, and have our very existence, okay? It's through Yahweh. So without Yahweh, mankind cannot exist, plain and simple. He is our creator. He made us. He's our heavenly Father. And the gods try to make mankind to think that he doesn't need his creator, of course. But, Yahweh is the Almighty. Yahweh can do anything. He can create anything. He can maintain anything. Nothing is impossible with Yahweh. So why would he need what looks like pitiful mankind, Why would he need mankind to complete his plan? Couldn't he just do it himself? What does he need man for, Why is he mindful of man? Well, it's not like Yahweh needs mankind to be Yahweh, okay? That's not the need that he has. But the simple thing is that it's not that kind of necessity that he needs man to be able to be Yahweh himself. But the fact is that Yahweh has in his plan to have mankind created and to be made into his image. So to bring his plan to completion, yes, he does need mankind, okay, to do that, to fulfill his plan. So that's the reason why. It's not something that mankind can boast about and to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, because it all has to do with the plan of Yahweh, like it says in Yakanan 1. Nothing is done in the plan that is not according to the way that Yahweh has it already all figured out, okay? Now, on verse 73 on the bottom of page 78, pastor says, he learned about computers long before computers were ever invented. He learned it from the Holy Scriptures, okay, and he knew these things. So let's continue on here. On the top of page 79, this is verse 74 if you're following along. He says, researchers discovered the key to the blood-brain barrier. He says, I know you all have heard of the blood-brain barrier. Okay, now highlight this, the blood-brain barrier. Because I brought it out before, he says, there is a barrier that surrounds your brain to keep blood out of it. Highlight that portion there. Blood-brain barrier. Okay, there's a barrier that surrounds your brain to keep the blood out. Okay, this is important stuff. So I think you'll grab it as we go on. You'll see the reason why. Beelzebub, get out of here, man! That thing keeps the blood-brain barrier. Okay, now the blood-brain barrier was discovered in the late 19th century when the German physician Paul Ehrlich injected a dye into the bloodstream of a mouse. To his surprise, the dye infiltrated all the tissues except the brain and the spinal cord. While this showed that there was a barrier existed between the brain and blood, it wasn't until the 1960s that researchers could use microscopes powerful enough to determine the physical layer of the blood-brain barrier. We now know that the key structure of the blood-brain barrier that offers a barrier is the endothelial tight junction. Endothelial cells line the interior of all blood vessels, and in the capillaries, they form the blood-brain barrier, and endothelial cells are wedged closely together, forming so-called tight junctions. Okay? Now, here is a picture I drew of the blood-brain barrier. Consider this as being the brain, okay? Now, in the blood vessel here, here's those endothelial cells. They're simply cells that are very tightly compact together, okay? So that they don't allow anything. The main purpose for them is not to allow the blood to come out of the vessel into tissue that it's not supposed to be in, okay? In this instance, of course, it's within the brain, okay? So as the blood cells flow through, okay, these cells that are tightly compact together, this forms that barrier. So it keeps the blood from coming out and going into the brain itself, okay? Now, it says, Well, let's keep going here. Okay, it says, back on the book here. Well, no, let's go in. Well, I guess we could get that. Yeah. Let's go into this here. Okay, the tight gap allows only small molecules, fat-soluble molecules, and some gases to pass freely through the capillary wall and into the blood tissue. Some larger molecules, such as glucose, can gain entry through transporter proteins, which act like special doors that open only for a particular molecule. Now think about this. This fat-soluble molecule, what would that be? Here's your blood-brain barrier. And there's the fat-soluble. Maybe like butter? Remember what butter does? And then, of course, you have where it says it gains entry, okay? And then some of the larger molecules, such as glucose, what is that? It's sugar, right? Sugar can gain entry through transporter proteins that open like special doors, okay? So here's your little sugar cube traveling down the highway there, okay? Now, this is able to go through the sugar, the glucose, as it says. It uses a transporter protein, okay, which opens up like a door and allows it to actually go out into the brain, okay? And then once these get into our brain, that's the butter and the honey that we eat that is able to affect our brain and help us to choose to do righteousness, okay? Now, it says, surrounding the endothelial cells of the blood vessel are other components of the blood-brain barrier that aren't strictly involved in stopping certain things from the blood to the brain, but which communicate with the cells that form the barrier to change how selective the blood-brain barrier is, okay? So communication is constantly going on between these guys, okay? Constantly going on, telling it what to do, what to allow through it, and what to keep from it, okay? So that's the magnificence that Yahweh has in the way that he's created us. Now, let's go back to the book here on verse 74. The blood-brain barrier, okay? Now, he says, anytime you have an injury to this blood-brain barrier, it can kill you or cause a short circuit in the brain, okay? Now, if you go back to chapter 9, we were in chapter 10, but if you go back to chapter 9 on page 66, and you look at verses 15 to 16, you can see more what he was referring to when he said this. And we covered this earlier. But he says, if science could see that we are not living in a chemical universe, we're living in an electrical universe that is controlled. Our bodies are not chemical. They're trying to doctor us with chemicals, but all this does is cause shorts in our wirings, diffusing and throwing of breakers and stuff like this that can cause us to go every which way. They can control certain things with chemicals, but they can't cure anything with chemicals. They can cause you other problems in other places where they have to put in more chemicals. If we can get them to realize that we have electrical bodies and the vitamins, minerals, calcium, and things like that serve to supply and connect that electricity and cause it to jump from here and there, okay? Now, when electricity is jumping from here to there, that's just signals that's going through the brain telling you to move your hand or blink your eyes and so forth, and all of these things that cause your body to work, okay? Such as muscles. Muscles contract because of electrical signals telling it to contract and so forth. All right, so back in the book here. So if you have an injury, this to the blood-brain barrier, it can cause the brain to short circuit. It can even kill you, okay? So he continues on. He says, if it is the part of the brain or the cells that send signals or send messages to your right arm, then your right arm will stop working and hang limp. If it's your left arm, then your left arm will hang limp. If it's your tongue will hang limp. You will not be able to use it to talk. There's a barrier we used to talk about that is made out of a double layer of protein. It's not just protein like we think of protein. It's much tougher than that. The way Yahweh arranged it is almost like a steel barrier, okay, like a steel barrier. Now, continuing on with this, look at this, and it says, why do we need the blood-brain barrier? Well, the purpose of the blood-brain barrier is to protect against circulating toxins or pathogens that can cause brain infections. You know, if you get this stuff into your brain, if it would pass through the blood and get into your brain, then of course your brain becomes infected. While at the same time, allowing vital nutrients to reach the brain. Its other functions to help maintain relatively constant levels of hormones, nutrients, and water in the brain. Fluctuations in which can disrupt the finely tuned environment. It's a very finely tuned environment, the way that Yahweh created. And of course, if we disrupt that, then it's going to cause problems, okay? So let's go back to the book here. This is on verse 75. He says, if you watch Star Trek, he said, they showed from time to time this invisible barrier where people would be running and they'd hit this thing. They couldn't go any further. You remember that? If you remember ever seeing that show? You know, they'd be chasing someone, or someone would have this room where they'd go in and they couldn't touch them. You know, it's like if they arrested someone, they'd have them in there and they'd turn on this invisible barrier and the person couldn't walk through it and you couldn't walk through it. It kept the person intact, okay, where you couldn't touch them. Well, he says it's almost like that. Yahweh warned us of it. And I brought this out especially in the X-rated sermons. You know, Yahweh warned us that, you know, if you're not careful and you sin, you can infect the brain by allowing these things to get through the blood-brain barrier, and it will enter into the brain and infect the brain. Now, Yahweh shows that certain diseases such as AIDS, gonorrhea, syphilis can actually get through this barrier. He says science cannot get through it to treat it with anything. Well, mankind keeps trying, and they've come up with some stupid ways, but what do we need to get through it? Well, the blood-brain barrier generally is very effective at preventing unwanted substances from accessing the brain, which has a downside. The vast majority of potential drug treatments do not readily cross the barrier, posing a huge impediment to treating mental and neurological disorders. One possible way around the problem that they consider as a problem, okay, is to trick the blood-brain barrier into allowing passage of the drug. This is the so-called Trojan horse approach, in which the drug is fused to a molecule that can pass the blood-brain barrier via a transporter protein. And a different approach is to temporarily open the blood-brain barrier using ultrasound. Now, this is the stupidity of man, you know. Yahweh made it to where it's set there that if you keep his laws, your brain is protected. But what has man done? Man wants to go in, because mankind has sinned, and they want to go in and correct the problem which sin has caused, and then they want to go in there and open up the blood-brain barrier to allow their drugs to go in there, which is just going to affect them even worse and mess them up. And that's the wonders of mankind, you know, to ultrasound. Well, ultrasound is just going to shake and vibrate and open up all kinds of other things as well. Okay, so let's continue on in the book here. He says, science cannot get through it to treat it with anything. If syphilis was there, then they would want to treat it in any other part of the body as well. Okay, so the barrier simply rejects this. That's the way Yahweh made it. He made it to where this would be rejected if the laws of Yahweh are kept. Okay? This bit of news here gives some hope, he says, because they now think that since they have found this key to unlock this barrier, that they can put the drugs in there. Highlight these next two sentences. The drugs are going to be like blood to the brain. They're going to short-circuit it. And also this next verse. They're going to have more troubles here than they had before. Okay? The drugs are going to be like blood to the brain. They're going to short-circuit it. They're going to have more troubles here than they did before. You know? Now, when you think about our bodies are electric. The flow of electrons or negative charge is what we call electricity. So Since our bodies are huge masses of atoms, we have all this electricity. We can generate a lot of electricity. But when we talk about the nervous system sending these signals to the brain, or the synapses firing in the brain, or the brain telling our hands to contract around the door handle, what we're talking about is electricity carrying messages from point A to point B. It's kind of like the digital signal that carries the ones and the zeros that deliver the news to your television. And except in our bodies, of course, the electrons are flowing along, not flowing along a wire, but instead it's an electrical charge that's jumping from one cell to the next, okay, until it finally reaches its destination. So electricity is a key to survival because electrical signals are fast and they allow for a nearly instantaneous response to control messages. But if our bodies relied entirely on what we say the movement of chemicals like they want to do, to tell our hearts to speed up when something's chasing us, we'd probably have died a long time ago, okay? Because it doesn't respond the same as these electrical signals, the way that Yahweh designed our bodies, okay? So you can see that Yahweh's in full control, and when man messes with the perfection of Yahweh, then of course there's going to be confusion and damage. Okay, back to the book here this is in verse 76. They will keep working, experimenting, and practicing because the license of a doctor gives him the right to practice on whoever's body is brave enough to go to him to practice on, you know. If you go to a doctor, then the doctor has the right to practice medicine. That's what they do, remember? They practice medicine. They practice on people. Everybody is a guinea pig when they go in there. Because what works for one person may not work for another person, but they're going to practice medicine to find out if it's going to work for you too. That's why the commercials say, ask your doctor if this medicine is right for you, okay? So he says, this article shows how they discover the keys that actually unlock this barrier, like using the ultrasound, you know, the vibrating and shaking it apart to where it actually disintegrates for a short moment, just enough for that drug to break through those cells, to shake those cells up, just enough to break through those cells and go into the brain, okay? So the doctors have hope that now what they're going through in the same ways that the diseases they went through to get to the brain, the diseases should not be able to go up there and penetrate this double layer of protein. It should be impossible to do so. Yahweh fixed it to where they couldn't. Now highlight these next couple of verses. There is a way. Yahweh has warned us not to do these things, or these curses will come upon you. Then if they come upon you and Yahweh cleanses you of it, which you can, and you turn back to it, then he says a worse thing will come upon you. Highlight that section. There's a way. Yahweh's warned us not to do these things, or these curses will come upon us. If they do, if Yahweh cleanses us and we turn back to him, then a worse thing will come upon us. Okay? Continue on in verse 78. He says, the scientists know when this is cleaned and repeated, that is worse the second time as well. And this is what Yeshua said as well, okay? In fact, he said in the reference source there in Matthew 12, verse 43 and 45, about matters being worse. Remember what he said? He said, when the unclean spirit is going out of a man, and the unclean walks around in dry places seeking rest but finding none, then he says, I'll go back to the house from which I came out of. And when he does, he finds it vacant, swept clean, and in order. Then he goes and brings with him 7 other spirits more evil than himself, and they enter in and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. And so it will also be with this wicked generation. Okay? So there's something to keep in mind there. Continue on here in verse 79, on page 79, top of the page. He says, the researchers at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in Baltimore have identified a receptor. A receptor is in your body. Your ear is a receptor. Okay? Your ear takes a vibration through electronics, and it can actually make a word out of it. Not the ear itself, but it's a receptor to take in certain portions of the brain. That's why your ear is cupped a certain way, so it will collect. It will collect the sound that's coming in. It goes in down the ear canal and then hits the eardrum, which is a little tiny bone that will vibrate. And through that vibration, that's turned into electrical signal, and then that electrical signal goes to your brain, and then your brain will intercept this thing, okay? So the brain actually makes a word out of that vibration, many, many words out of the many vibrations. And you would think all these sounds would start sounding alike after a certain time, but it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't, because that's the way that Yahweh made it. But they don't on the computers in your mind and your body. He says, I've brought out and shown that there are trillions of these computers in your mind and your whole body that make your finger move, that make your eye blink, that makes you think. This is what Spirit Holy does if you will accept Spirit Holy. Okay, so he likens all these things together. He says you have to associate one with the other in order to understand what I'm trying to show you. Unholy Spirit, taking just a portion of it, will start you in the other direction, which you have been going the way that you're going for such a long time. Okay? You remember what you catch 18:24 says. But when the righteous man turns away from his righteousness and commits iniquity and does according to all the abominations that the wicked man does, shall he live? All of his righteousness that he has done will not be mentioned on his behalf. In his trespass, he has trespassed, and in his sin, he has sinned. In them, you will die. And in 2 Yachanah 1:8, there's another place. He says, look out for yourselves that you do not lose those things which you have worked for that we might receive a full reward. Okay, we've been working so hard for all of these things, and it would be a real shame to lose all of this. Now, highlight the rest of that paragraph there, where it says, if you partake of something that is forbidden in Yahweh's laws, if you cross that barrier, you trespass. Remember this, because this very thing is shown in the scriptures that we're about to enter into in this study. So if you partake of something that's forbidden in Yahweh's laws, if you cross that barrier, you trespass. Okay, and that's how the curses come. Okay? Now, continue on here. He says, I don't know if any of you have ever grown potatoes or tomatoes, but first there comes the sprout from the potato. For now it's receiving all the food from the soil. Okay, it's receiving this into the eyes. They call them eyes, the eyes of the potatoes. When they first start sprouting out, okay, the potato begins to soften a little bit, and these eyes will start forming. And if you let it grow there long enough, it will actually start growing the plant, okay? Well, you cut those up, and then you put them in the ground, and that's how you grow potatoes. But they call these eyes, and these are receptors to make the potato grow and to reproduce in its kind. And then, of course, comes the vine, and the vine reaches up from the ground. The vine reaches up, and a receptor for more ingredients or food comes from the sun, and the wind, and also the firmament. Remember, the firmament feeds all these plants. And the bees, and everything starts feeding that potato. And soon you have a full-grown potato that's ready to go into the oven to bake and to eat or whatever you want to do with it, okay? So you also have, as it says, the sunflowers or flowers are receptors. He says, I'd like you to fully understand what a receptor is because you have them throughout your body. A flower that comes up and blooms and reaches out. It opens up, not just to show you how pretty it is, but because it's feeding from the sun, okay? The sun is actually feeding it, and it's receiving this power from the sun that comes in there, okay? It actually feeds from the sun that comes in there because the sun is the main source of energy for almost every living thing on earth, okay? And it actually gives the plant the light energy to photosynthesize, okay? And then what it does is it converts the light energy that's coming into it, and it stores it into glucose, which is sugar, okay? Now, plants actually create their own food, okay? And they do that by feeding off the sun. And if you'll notice, during the day, the leaves of a plant will track the sun. They'll actually start moving. In the morning, you'll start seeing them opening up, and then they'll start following the sun as they absorb that energy from them. And of course, the byproduct from the photosynthesis is oxygen, which all animals need. Okay, we all need oxygen to live on. So you can see how intricate Yahweh made these things to work together. So the sunflowers or the flowers themselves open up, and they are a receptor. They absorb the sun, the energy coming from the sun. They receive it. Okay? He says, then it goes to the different parts of the plant. It makes the leaves grow, produce, and develop the ingredients that you need for food. And this is the reason these things were created. They're all called receptors. Okay? Now, with that in mind, these researchers, and remember he was saying they'd probably be good-looking researchers. They're not worth a damn, but they're good-looking because everybody is good-looking these days. Remember, we was talking about how people get prideful and stuff, and how that we don't look at the outward appearance, but we look at the righteousness, the character within what Yahweh has made within us. But these people do, you know, they get thinking themselves very highly because they're highly educated, you know, and they think about how they know so much, and that they look down upon people who aren't in their field of study and so forth, you know. They get puffed up with pride, and that's what Yahweh says. He cuts off the pride. So continuing on with this article, he says, they have identified a receptor in the human brain which regulates the interface. He says, now, if you know computers, if you're going to know what I'm talking about when the interface. Okay, highlight this because this is one of the vocabulary words. The interface is a surface regulated as a common boundary of two bodies, spaces, or phases. Okay? We'll get into that. But notice he continues on here, and he says, listen closely to this because you have to understand what this is. A surface regarded as the common boundary of two bodies, spaces, or phases. The area shared or linked to two or more disciplines. Now, he's getting into some words here that he wants you to understand. The word discipline, okay, he says you have to understand what disciplines are. Discipline, highlight this is another vocabulary word. Discipline is training or acting in accordance with rules, okay? So everything is set up with rules. The way that, and what is a rule? A rule is a law, okay? Everything that Yahweh has made is set up to run by rules. You know, a plant takes the sunlight in, but first of all, the sun has to produce the energy, okay? It has to produce the photons, you know, the wavelength and so forth that comes through from the sun. It has to do that, operate all of this in accordance with the law of Yahweh, okay? Everything is set down when Yahweh made these things. You see in Genesis 1, and everything is made according to the law. Now, it has to send out these photons, and a photon is a wavelength of energy, but it has to be the proper amount. You know, the wave has to be in the proper phase and going on and off and so forth. Think about a wave, you know, a wave of energy, just like that, a wave. It goes up and down as it pulses. It has to be at the certain frequency, okay? And frequency, all frequency is the formula for frequency is 1 over T. And T means time. So it's 1 over T, or 1 over time. Like these lights up here. These lights are flickering and turning on once every 60 seconds. But it's so fast that your eyes don't even see it. It looks like it's constantly being on, but it's not. It's turning on and off, on and off, on and off. 60 times a second, okay? So you have to, everything is made according to that. And everything is built upon frequencies. Colors, different colors of frequencies, because your light source comes in. You know, for one thing, you know that the light itself, what we see as sunlight, is white light. It's a combination of colors. When you take a prism or a piece of glass or anything that has a shiny coating and you put it there, you start seeing the colors in it, right? As it breaks down the white light, you see the color of the rainbow colors in there, okay? And that's what light is. It's actually all these different lights, these different colors, but it's combined together to make white light that we see. Well, different lights absorb off of the frequencies, absorb off of certain things. And this is why we see colors with our eyes. You know, we see something that is red because that thing that is red is only absorbing the red frequency. And it's bouncing off all of the others. And so therefore it tends to look like it's red, okay? And this is why you have different colors and stuff. So everything is made that way, but everything is laid down by a law, the way that Yahweh made the laws of Yahweh in order to make sure that everything works properly, okay? And there's some colors that don't even exist, okay? Like pink. Pink doesn't exist. There's no such color. But your mind interprets that color to be what it is. Because as the light comes into your eyes, it has the rods and the cones, which are those little microorganisms that's in the back of your eyeball, and it absorbs these things and it interprets it and sends it to the brain as a certain color, and you see these things. So it's amazing the way that Yahweh has made all of these things. So everything has to be done according to these rules or these laws, okay? And so that's what a discipline is. Now, he's talking about an interface. I'll cover that in a moment. Okay, so back to the book here. Discipline is training to act in accordance with the rules. Underline that, highlight it, whatever. That's a vocabulary word. So the training to act in accordance with rules is found in this receptor that has the interface in it. Okay? Not only that, but he says, let me read further. Now he continues with this word, and discipline, it means activity or exercise or a regimen that develops or improves a skill. Okay? Because the more you do something, the better you become skilled at it, right? He says that's the training to act in accordance with rules that improves the skills, or in our case, of course, righteousness. If you practice righteousness, you become righteous, right? The more you practice something, the better off you become. Punishment inflicted by way of correction and training. Of course, we don't get punished, but the thing is, we learn of the curses. We know that the curses can follow. He says a vigor or training effort of experiencing adversity, which we're in right now, as he says, and having to overcome and to reject it. Adversity is there. We have to make the choice as to which way we go and what we choose, whether we have a negative attitude or a positive attitude, right? It also means behavior in rules in accord with conduct, like righteous discipline in your training to become part of a kingdom, right? We have to be disciplined. We have to have, our behavior has to be in accordance with the rules. If we follow the rules and follow the laws, then we become as that law. We take on that law, and that law becomes ours, right? We become that law, and that's why we become as Yahweh, and Yahweh works within us, okay? And he can't reject his people when they're following his laws and keeping his laws. That's what attracts Yahweh to us, when we are obedient to him, okay? It also means a branch or instruction of learning. A branch or an instruction or learning, okay? A branch, you think about things branching out. It's a certain area, so to speak, okay, of learning. It means to train by instruction and exercise, okay? Well, the more you train, the more you exercise, the more disciplined you become. The more you practice righteousness, the more righteous you become, and the easier it is to choose righteousness over evil. And it means to train by instruction and exercise, to drill, rehearsing. We learn through repetition, right? We're humans. We learn through repetition. That's how you get skillful at things. For instance, if you're a carpenter and you pick up a hammer and a nail, eventually you're going to smash your nail, but it's going to be the wrong nail, right? You're going to end up hitting your hand and stuff. But the more skilled you become, the faster you can become at it, okay? The more skillful you become, the more you do it. It means to bring to a state of order, okay? And that's what Yahweh's law does. That's what, when we are disciplined, it brings us to a state of order. It's no longer confusion, but now everything is orderly done. In obedience by training and control. And of course, Yahweh is in full control. So we have to be trained according to his word, okay? Now it says, now with this in mind, go back to interface, okay? Interface is a surface regarded as a common boundary of two bodies, spaces, or phases. The area shared by linking two or more disciplines or fields of study. A common boundary or interconnection of bodies, separate and sometimes incompatible elements to coordinate or communicate. You got that? That's a simple definition, right? Very simple. Okay. Look, an interface, an easy way to think about an interface is think about a computer system. You know what a touch screen is, right? Okay, a touch screen is the interface. You touch it, Okay? Well, it's an interface between you and the computer. When you touch it, and I'm sure you probably heard of GUI, graphical user interface. Okay, that's what that is. When you touch the screen, okay, it interprets the touch, and it interfaces between you and the computer itself. Okay, it sends a signal from the touch from the screen. The screen now takes that signal, sends that signal to the CPU. The CPU interprets it, and then it goes to the software, which is another type of interface, and it reads it and sees what it is, and then it interprets, and then you have the output as a result. Okay, so an interface, think of that as an interface. The graphics on the screen, like a button or a logo, when you touch it, the command is interpreted by the computer. Okay, plain and simple. So it is with the human body, with Yahweh. We have an interface. Spirit Holy interfaces between us, okay, and between us and Yahweh, and that's how we communicate with Yahweh. Okay, it's through the interface, and that's what he's trying to show us here and tell us. So continuing on here, he says, so don't get confused about the big old, the possibly confusing definitions. Just think of it in simple terms. It's something that just interfaces between you and something else. And what we're talking about here is with Yahweh. How Spirit Holy interfaces between us and Yahweh. Okay? Now continuing, he says, this interface is then something that comes between, or something that can receive as a receptor. That's what we're talking about. Remember when we talk about the flowers that receives the sun, the energy from the sun, okay? The receptor actually has something in it that can receive something from Yahweh. Without that something in our receptors, we could not receive this connection with him. So it actually connects you with Yahweh so that you can communicate with Yahweh, okay? And of course, one of the scriptures that reminds me of that is in Romans 8, 26 and 28, when it says, in the same way the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses, for we might not know how to offer our prayer worthily as we ought. But the Spirit itself intercedes for us, which groans that words cannot express. And he who searches the hearts of men knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints in accordance with the will of Yahweh. And we know that all things work together for righteousness to those who love Yahweh, to those who are called out according to his plan, okay? And so the Spirit intercedes, okay? It intercedes on our behalf and actually communicates with Yahweh. And, because sometimes we may not know, like I said, we may not know really how to pray or what to pray for or whatever, but something, we have a problem, and we go before Yahweh and we don't know really how to express ourselves, Well, this is the communication that Yahweh can have with us, or we can have with Yahweh, is that this will intercede on our behalf, okay? Verse 88 here. Now, highlight these next two sentences. Keep in mind, too, that if you go back to sin, a worse thing comes upon you. First thing, it cuts you off. It cuts off this receptor that you have, okay? It cuts off the receptor. When you leave Yahweh, you cut yourself off from Yahweh, right? And so there's no way to receive any power from Yahweh, okay? So when you shut off this receptor from which you can have communication with Yahweh, now you no longer are able to communicate with him. And that's why he says he turns his face from us, because we've shut off that receptor. We no longer have something that we can receive from him, okay? Because remember, the law and the prophets is the strength or the power of Yahweh. So when you're righteous and you're practicing Yahweh's laws, your receptor is there. It's open. It's receiving the power from Yahweh that you receive from keeping his laws, from being righteous. That's where, remember, even the Apostle Shalom says, when I'm weak, that's when I'm the strongest, Because when you're weak, Yahweh is there. Yahweh never leaves us nor forsakes us, and he's always there to be able to help us. He's not going to leave us. He's going to be there to be able to help us through, to make sure that he can continue to work with us as long as we don't reject him. Weakness, now when you're weak, you can also turn into sin, right? Because you can give in. But if you don't give in and you're struggling, the way you keep struggling and struggling, the strength of Yahweh is there to help you make it through it. Remember, and he says he's not going to put anything on us that we can't handle, right? No more on us than what we can handle. So he's allowing us to remain strong to continue to make it through that test and trial. Okay, continue on with this definition here. He says communication or interaction. Computer hardware or software designed to communicate information between a computer and a user, to function as an interface, to meet or communicate directly, interact, or coordinate. And that's just really just using an example of what an interface is. According with a computer, you have computer hardware and computer software. And both of these things, as I explained, are interfaces, okay? They interface with the computer itself. Now, he says, when we will go back, he says, to this article again so you'll understand what it's actually saying here. But he says, this is a great discovery because to me, it shows how we actually connect with Yahweh. It shows how we actually connect with Yahweh. Remember, Yahweh is not the author of confusion. He wants us to keep a solid, sound mind, right? And practicing Yahweh's laws causes us to have a sound mind. When we break those laws, now we open up, and this is how sickness and sin and diseases and stuff enter into the brain because the blood-brain barrier is broken down, and these things enter into the brain, and they cause confusion. And now you no longer have a sound mind in the connection with Yahweh. He says to them, it shows them somewhere of something where they have hopes of getting a drug into the same receptor to get your brain to where they can doctor the curse that you've caused by breaking the law to begin with. Now, it gets on to the article again. He says, the researchers at the University of Maryland, School of Medicine at Baltimore, have identified a receptor in the human brain that regulates the interface between the bloodstream and the brain, which is known as the blood-brain barrier. This breakthrough could lead a better understanding of the nearly impenetrable barrier and to the treatment of diseases that affect the brain. And they call several of these things causing HIV. Remember this blood-brain barrier, okay? What they want, is to be able to have the blood-brain barrier, but they want their drugs, right? They want their drugs to flow through, and they want their drugs to be shaken so this breaks apart and it goes straight into the brain, okay? And that's what they want to do. They want to be able to deliver these drugs into the brain, okay? And, of course, that's just causing more and more problems because of the fact that it doesn't belong there. If Yahweh made these drugs, he would have created these drugs and put them in our brains to begin with, right? But instead, he's made this blood-brain barrier to keep these things out. But mankind, because of his sin, has caused them to enter in, okay? And this is why we have the sickness and disease and everything that we have nowadays. Let's continue on here. In verse 92, he says, here a while back they were saying, no, these things can't get into the brain. And I said, yes, they can. They're wrong here. He says, one day they'll find this out because I see in the scriptures where these things actually affect the brain. So I knew that these things were going to the brain, and I knew one day they would find that out. He knew from the scriptures what the scriptures taught, that, yes, these things would get to the brain, and this is what would cause the confusion. Continuing with that article, he says, the blood-brain barrier is a collection of cells that presses together to block many substances from entering the brain while allowing others to pass. And remember, these things have, I didn't put it on here, but they have little, like it described it, like little gates that will open up, okay? And this is where these receptors, the receptors will come through, and these proteins and so forth, and they will allow this to open up, and it will be released into the brain. But that's where your fats and your glucose, your butter and your honey is able to enter into your brain and allow you to make the right choices and so forth and choose righteousness, okay? It allows it to go ahead and enter into the brain, and that's the way that Yahweh made it. But he didn't make it for pork, but yet they'll eat their own things, and they wonder why they have all these problems and stuff, you know? Okay, continue on here. He says it allows certain things to pass because there is an electrical connection there. This one travels up the stem because this receptor they found is not in the brain, it's in the intestines. So when this receives something, it's electrical, like we saw in the Star Trek, okay? Remember, it's in the intestines. You know, you have the gut as the second brain, okay? Because the entire nervous system is a complex system of about 100 million cells. It's found in the lining of your gut. And sometimes it's called the second brain, where our intrinsic nervous system, okay, doesn't figure out philosophical or make executive decisions like the gray matter in your brain does, right? The gray shiny mound in our skulls. Yet in a miraculously orchestrated symphony of hormones, neurotransmitters, and electrical impulses through a pathway of nerves, both of these brains, the one that's in the gut and the one that's in your head, communicate back and forth. And at this point in time, it's very clear that the brain and the gut, they work so closely together, they're so intimately connected that sometimes it seems like it's just one system, not two, okay? And so you have these two brains that's working together. And also, of course, you have a third brain, which is your heart, okay? So you have your heart, your gut, and your brain, okay? So you can see how all of this works together, because with the heart, you make your decisions and so forth. With your brain, you think and so forth. With your gut, what you eat, the proper foods that you eat and put inside your stomach would communicate with your brain and with your heart and cause your heart to bring forth the actions that you create to do righteousness, okay? So all of these things are working together. And we have these receptors which receive the power of Spirit Holy from Yahweh, which intercedes on our behalf, which helps us to be able to make the right decisions, to make that connection with Yahweh himself. All right. Continuing back in the book, he says, like in Star Trek, he says, I'll go back to the space show again. He says, where the guy steps inside this thing and says, beam me up. Well, that's what occurs. He says, the portion of food, like the amino acids that the brain receives, it uses for fuel along with other things. It will not just receive that by itself, but along with other things. And it steps into this receptor and it says, beam me up. And it's gone. It goes straight to the human brain, and then the human brain can use it as food to eat and to function on. Now, like we eat food and our bodies function as one big giant computer. You know, we all function together. There's trillions and trillions of computers within our bodies that work together and functions together. That's the way Yahweh made us. In mitochondria, you probably heard of that before. What it is it's organized or specialized structures that actually float around inside the cells, okay? And their specialty, because they're organized and they're specialized, but their specialty is that they're the cell's power stations, okay? They transform the energy that's stored in the nutrients for the use by the cells. So this is what causes the electrical signals to be produced, causing signals to jump from cell to cell throughout your body to eventually, and this is extremely fast that this is done, but these mitochondria, these are the power stations, okay? Inside the cells, your cells itself, it takes the nutrients out of the blood and the foods that you eat, and it's a power station, okay? And it actually produces the electricity that your cells need to operate on, okay? And so your cells have, you have potentials between your negative or positive charge. You have potentials between the sodium and the calcium and so forth that's in your body, and this is what causes the charges to be produced and so forth. Now, all this is done on a microscopic level, because remember, this is done on the atomic level, okay? These are little atoms that are actually charged and actually doing these things. And, of course, as they get together, of course, they produce the molecules that are needed. And this signal goes throughout your body. It jumps from cell to cell to cell to cell, and your body, it's like a big chain of cells, and this is how the connection is made. Not along a wire, but similar to a wire. So he says, inside our bodies are trillions of computers that have to have food to function properly. He says, now think of this, because Yahweh compared the house of Yahweh to a body. Okay? Now underline this next two sentences, or highlight it. You can't function without this body. If you come against the body, brethren, he says, you're fighting against Yahweh himself. Okay? You can't come against the body. If you do, you're fighting against Yahweh himself. Remember, in the very beginning, Genesis 2:9, Yahweh says, and out of the ground Yahweh made every tree grow. Every tree grow that's pleasant to the sight. And notice, it was desirable for food. And then in the midst of the garden was the tree of righteousness and evil, and the tree of the knowledge of righteousness and evil, right? The tree of righteousness and also the tree of the knowledge of righteousness and evil. But notice in the beginning, Yahweh made food for man to live on. Okay? Every tree desirable for food. But he also gave the clean and the unclean. And this is why it's so important to follow these laws, because like he says, if you come against the food, you fight against Yahweh. If you eat the unclean, and he said, this you shall eat, this you shall not eat, okay? And he gave specific instructions on why something should be eaten and something should not be eaten, because otherwise you eat the wrong thing, but we'll see that in a second, but you cause trouble for yourself. Continue on, he says, if you come against the teaching and do not humble yourself before Yahweh, you will never be taught or be able to be a part of Yahweh's kingdom, because you're classified as a witch or a rebellious bastard, someone without a head or without the head who Yahweh has appointed. Now underline these next two sentences, or highlight. This brain could not function without the receptor in the intestine. Nothing can get through it. It could not get the food without the rest of the body. Okay? It all works together. It all works together. Remember, certain fats can enter into the brain and help us. Certain fats can also enter into the brain and destroy us. Okay? Now he says, continue on, he says, you could get food without the rest of it. You could not get food without the rest of the body. Notice, when you rebel against the food, you rebel against the only source that will eventually connect you with Yahweh. Now, that's the importance of the clean and the unclean, okay? Because certain fats can enter into the brain, but if it's the wrong fat, such as pork, you wonder how they get worms in the brains of people? They wonder how it gets there. Well, it goes through and it breaks through, it fools, it tricks the system, and it gets through and it enters into the brain. Because remember, the blood-brain barrier will allow certain fats, right? Fats and sugars to get into it. Well, pork is a fat. And the wrong fat, because you ate the wrong thing, you didn't keep Yahweh's law, then that fat will enter into the brain. And remember, these trichins, very tiny little critters. And before you know it, a person's brain can be filled with worms. And that's why they're discovering these things nowadays. But they don't understand this. They're not making the connection with why not allow Yahweh perfection to lead and to guide you so that you can make that connection with him. They're not seeing that part. We'll continue on here. He says, for years, scientists knew very little about the barrier, about how the barrier was regulated, or why certain diseases were able to manipulate the barrier and infect the brain, like the blood, like the trichinosis, all of these worms in the person's brain. Now there's a discovery. He says there are a couple of words, zonulin and zot. Zot is actually an abbreviation for a longer word, but zonulin and zot. And those who will become household words in the house of Yahweh very soon, he says, you'll understand it. It's a great connection because it shows how the body works. Zonulin and zot. Let me show you this. The blood-brain barrier is a collection of cells that press together to block many substances from entering the brain, while allowing others to pass. Well, research has found that two proteins known as zonulin and zot unlock the cell barrier in the intestine. The proteins attach themselves to receptors, which we've been talking about, in the intestine to open the junctions between the cells and allow substances to be absorbed. They also react with similar receptors in the brain. The blood-brain barrier is like a gateway to the brain, and it's almost always locked, keeping out many diseases, if it's done the way that Yahweh has created it to be, okay? But otherwise, it allows these things to enter into the brain. And then because of that, people have problems, okay? And so they have brains that's full of worms, you know? Just doesn't make any sense. So he says, well, before these sermons are over, you'll understand this connection that I've been wanting you to understand. This is the connection that connects you with Yahweh, so he can start supplying you with power, much power. And we can't even comprehend the amount of power that Yahweh wants to give unto us. And remember, with that power comes extreme authority and a responsibility as well to be able to control that, because we'll never use that power in any way to bring harm to another living creature, not even a tiny microbe, okay? And that's what Yahweh wants to give into us. Well, that finishes this chapter here. But you can see, hopefully you get a little bit more understanding of how intricate this is, but how beautiful it is, and the way that Yahweh has allowed us to understand this, because no one understands these things that Pastor taught us. No one understands these things except the house of Yahweh. We're the only ones, because we're the only ones that Yahweh's working with. We are his people. We are his house. Yahweh bless you, man.